Okay, good day, students. Today we're going to start our lecture number 23 of sociolinguistics, and it's going to be a continuation of what we were studying in the previous. So, giving you a briefing of sociolinguistics, it's the relationship between language and society. Now, while we were studying about how society affects language, and if language affects society also or not. So we cannot be content with butterfly collecting, no matter how beautiful the specimens are. So butterfly collecting is not possible, even if the specimens, that means like they're trying to give an example that it can't be, you can't keep on collecting different things into in investigation or into a study just because they are different or that they are attractive in some way. So we must collect data for a purpose. So it's not about how the data attracts the investigators or the researchers, but how much purpose it has. And that purpose should be to find an answer to the questions, or answers to an interesting question. So questions phrased in ways that do not allow for some kind of empirical testing have no more than a speculative interest. So questions that would be phrased in, let's say, a speculative, an empirical testing in a speculative way, they wouldn't have anything, they wouldn't have that much interest in them, you see. So those who seek to investigate the possible relationships between language and society must have a twofold concern. So they must ask good questions, and they must find the right kinds of data that bear on those questions. So it's all about seeking to investigate the relationships between language and society, but the researchers need to have a grip on both the things. They need to know how to ask the questions, they need to know what data is going to be related to language and society, and vice versa, and what effect that would have. Now, we will discover how wide the variety of questions and data in sociolinguistics has been. So, correlational studies, which attempt to relate two or more variables, for example, certain linguistic usages to social class differences, or implicational studies, which suggest that if X, then Y. For example, if someone says test for tests, does he or she also say best for best? So that means, like, do they pronounce the T at the end or not, or in between? So micro-linguistic studies, which typically focus on very specific linguistic terms or individual differences and uses, and seek possible wide-ranging linguistic or social implications. Now, for example, the distribution of singing and singing. So how we shorten the words, microlinguistics would study that how when we are pronouncing the words, the written word would be with an ing, but when we are pronouncing it, we would shorten it to singin, like in, just finishing it at that. So does that really count for a change in language? Now, in macrolinguistic studies, which examine large amounts of language data now to draw broad conclusions about group relations, for example, choices made in language planning, and still other studies which try to arrive at generalizations about certain universal characteristics of human communication, for example, studies of conversational structure. So in macro-linguistic, we would say that it would examine how language data, you can draw it to a larger board of conclusions, and how you make group relations in it, and the choices that you make in planning the language. So still other studies would try to achieve the generalizations. That means that they just get the general points of it. But the universal characteristics of human communication or studies of conversational structure are different, you see. So they can't be changed. So since sociolinguistics is an empirical science, it must be founded on an adequate database. So as we will see, that database is drawn from a wide variety of sources. These include censuses, documents, surveys, and interviews. Now, some data require the investigator to observe naturally occurring linguistic events, for example, conversations. So sociolinguistics would be that it is an empirical science, and based on the database, adequate database, and drawn from different sources. So some of those sources would be census, documents, surveys, or interviews that they conduct for the research. And some data require the investigator to observe the naturally occurring linguistic events in conversations. Now, others require the use of various elicitation techniques to gain access to the data we require, and different varieties of experimental manipulation. Now, for example, the matched guise experiment referred to. So some kinds of data require various statistical procedures, particularly when we wish to make statements about the typical behavior of a group. Now, for example, a social class, other kinds seem best treated through such devices as graphing, scaling, and categorizing in non-statistical ways. So as in dialect geography or the study of kinship systems. So what we would say that when we see in different various techniques taken for research in sociolinguistics, it would be one of them would be the match-guised experiments. Now, those are in which we take some data of different statistical procedures. We would make sure that the statements are about just typical behavior, something that we normally do in a daily life. A social class, like from which class do we belong from, let's say, rich families or poor families, or high social class or lower social class. And other kinds seem best treated through such devices as graphing, so they can also treat them through graphing, scaling, or categorizing in non-statistical ways, and the kinship of the systems. So all of these things would be experimented on. A bona fide empirical science now sets stringent demands so far as data collecting and analysis are concerned. So demands involving sampling techniques, error estimation, and confidence level. So they, in empirical science, they would say that some stringent demands of the data would be that the way we would collect the data would be involving error estimation, how much errors do we make, an estimate of that, the confidence level of the speaker, or the level of significance with which certain statements can be made. So their importance is very certain in this. Then particularly when arguments are based on numbers, for example, averages, percentages, or portions. So as we will see, sociolinguists try to meet these statistical demands when they are required. Now, however, many of the conclusions we can draw from sociolinguistic studies are of a non-statistical nature and leave no element of doubt. So this is because much of the language's use is categorical. So we put them in categories. So something is and is not, rather than statistical, that some phenomena occurs with this or that probability. So we treat language more in a categorized way than in a statistical way. So a recurring concern now then must be with considering the certainty with which we can draw our conclusions in sociolinguistics. So what is the theoretical framework? What are the relevant data? So first of all, we want to see the certainty of which we can draw conclusions in the research in psycholinguistics. So first we would say what would be the theoretical framework of that. Then the relevant data that we have collected. Then what confidence can we have in gathering of the data also, and in the analysis of that data then. So what do the results really show us? How should they be interpreted in relation to such concepts as identity, power, solidarity, class, gender, etc. So we want to see what results they show according to the gender. Does a male and a female have a difference in the way they treat language in society? Power, solidarity, the class, social class, does it really make a difference on language also? Identity, the origin that we belong from. So what do we mean by such concepts now? When we look at it in an overall view, then how useful are they in trying to achieve an understanding of how people function in a society? Do you think these questions are important to achieve the understanding of how people would behave in a society? And what kind of social theory do we subscribe to? So what would we subscribe to? In these respects, sociolinguistics is like all other sciences. So we should expect no less than that these requirements be met. Now, as a part of an attempt to work out a set of principles or axioms which sociolinguistic investigations should follow, Bell in 1976 said that drawing extensively on the work of Leboeuf has suggested 8 as worthy of consideration. So they have attempted a set of principles, 8 principles, according to the work of Leboeuf, to see that drawing, is this related to the sociolinguistic investigations, and do they have a difference on the investigation? So number 1 would be the cumulative principle. Now, the more that we know about language, the more we can find out about it. And we should not be surprised if our search for new knowledge takes us into new areas of study and into the areas in which scholars from other disciplines are already working also. So the cumulative principle would be that do we know more about language than we already know, or the knowledge that we already have? And would we be not surprised if our search for new knowledge would take on different areas of the study? And which scholars from other disciplines are already working on this? So that would be one part, the cumulative principle. Now the second part is information principle. Now, in information principle, the linguistic processes which we observe to be taking place around us are the same as those which we have operated in the past. So when we look at the situations, we would say that the uninformation principle would be that the things that are taking place around us, are they the same as the ones that happened in the past? So that there can be no clean break synchronic, for example, descriptive or contemporary, matters diachronic, which are historical ones. Would they make a difference in it? Now, the third principle would be the principle of convergence. Now, what is the principle of convergence and what does it do? The value of new data for confirming or interpreting old findings is directly proportional to the differences in the ways in which the new data are gathered. So we would say that the value of new data for confirming the old findings, that if we take them, we see the new data, and then we confirm them with interpreting the old data, old findings, and see that if there any difference between them. And in what different new way did we collect the data from the ways that previous people have collected it in the past? So particularly useful are linguistic data gathered through procedures needed in other areas of scientific investigation. So particularly useful would be that. Now, the principle number 4 would be the principle of subordinate shift. Now, when speakers of a non-standard or subordinate variety of language, for example, a dialect, are asked direct questions about that variety, their responses will shift in an irregular way towards or away from the standard or superordinate variety. So in a way we would say that we have direct questions about that variety, and their responses will shift to an irregular way towards the standard or the subordinate variety. Now, for example, the standard language would be so enabling investigators to collect valuable evidence concerning such matters as varieties, norms, and the change in those. So the principle of subordinate shift would be that do we, speakers of non-standard or a variety of language, do they have a different way of asking questions, direct questions, or will their responses be different in a way, or irregular from the standard method, which would enable the investigators to collect the valuable evidence concerning such matters as the norms and the change in it. So number 5 principle, the principle of style shifting. Now, style shifting would be that there are no single style speakers of a language. There is no one type. You can't put people in the same category and say that they are the single style and they speak in the same way. So because every individual would has controls and uses a variety of linguistic styles, and no one speaks in exactly the same way in all the circumstances. So the principle of attention would be styles of speech can be ordered along a single dimension measured by the amount of attention speakers are giving to their speech. So number 6 would be the principle of attention, of how different styles of speech are measured according to different dimensions, and how do the speakers give attention to that speech so that they're more aware that they are what they're saying and are more formal with the style, and their style would be more formal. So number 7 principle would be the vernacular principle. Now in the vernacular principle, the style which is most regular in its structure and its relation to the history of language is the vernacular. Now that relaxed spoken style in which the least conscious attention is being paid to speech. In the way when somebody is speaking in a very relaxed and easy manner, and they are not paying attention to exactly their speech format of how they're saying it. So the vernacular principle would be the style in which the relation, how language is related to the relation to the history of the language, to the way in how people would speak it in a relaxed way. Now principle 8, the principle of formality, the last principle. And the principle of formality would be any systematic observation of speech defines a context in which some conscious attention will be paid to that speech, so that it will be difficult without great ingenuity to observe the genuine vernacular. So the principle of formality would be that any systematic observation of speech defines a context in which some conscious attention will be paid to that speech, and that it will be difficult without great ingenuity to observe the genuine vernacular. So the last principle now accounts for what Leboeuf has called the observer's paradox. Now he points out in 1972 in his book that the aim of linguistic research is to find out how people talk when they are not being systematically observed. So when you're normal, that you're not being observed in any systematic way, but you're in a general conversation in your daily life, let's say. But the data are available only through systematic observation. So what Leboeuf wanted to do was he wanted to conduct a linguistic research in which he would see people speaking or talking without, when they're not aware of the system systematically being observed. But when you want to collect data now for the research, that could only be done in the systematic observation way. It can't be done in the other. So somehow speakers must have their attention diverted away from the fact that they are being observed so that the vernacular can emerge. So sometimes we need to divert the speakers so their attention is diverted and they can bring forth the vernacular in them. So this can happen when speakers become emotional. So Leboeuf found that a question, when you become emotional, you would maybe, if you are either sad or happy or angry, you would lose your temper, and you can, like in anger, say things that you're speaking in a formal way, and suddenly you would get emotional, and then you would start speaking in a completely informal way. So that's when vernacle would emerge. Or when you're happy, you forget about the norms of the rules of the grammatical rules in the speech, and then you use slang words also in happiness. So Lebeau found that a question like, have you been in a situation where you were in serious danger of being killed, nearly always produces a shift of style away from the careful speech towards the vernacular, thus providing the linguist with the kinds of data being sought. So the above principles are fundamental to studies in language variation. Now, other kinds of studies will require other kinds of principles. So trying to make these explicit will be one of the tasks I hope to accomplish in the chapters that would be following now in our slides. So in the discussion, we would say that number one would be the uniformation principle. So in discussion, the uniformation principle mentioned above proposes that there is a relationship between synchronic, descriptive, and diachronic historical statements made about a language. Now, there has been a long advocacy in linguistics for separating the two. So you can see Saucer in 59 or Bloomfield in 1933, and just about any introductory linguistic test written prior to the mid-70s. That would make it clear that there has been a long advocacy in linguistics for separating the two, separating synchronic from diachronic, the descriptive from the historical. Now try to discover the reasons that are usually given for such an insistence on separation. So to convince yourself that there are no single style speakers, try for an hour or two not to vary your speech style as circumstances would change. So to convince yourself, you could say that you can try no single style. You convince yourself that there are no single style speakers. That means that there is people who don't have a similar way of speaking. Now try for an hour or two to vary your speech style as circumstances would change. So what you want to do is vary your own speech style so that circumstances would change. Now, for example, try to speak to your cat or dog, your close friends, your teachers, and complete strangers with exactly the same degree of formality or informality. That principles of word choice, precision of articulation, and method of address. So John, Mr. Smith, or Sir. So try using all three of them and see how you can accomplish that. So report what happened and how you felt about what you were doing as the setting and the participants changed. And so how did others react? Now be careful, you might run into difficulties because you never know if people can be offended by, like I said, if you just, instead of calling him Sir or Mr. Smith, if you just go ahead and call him John by the first name, then that person might be offended by it. So for Lebeau and other sociolinguists, the vernacular is very important. Now, how do you understand, what would you understand by this term? Now, when do you use such a variety? How easy or difficult is self-observation of that variety? Now, on the whole, we will be concerned with the spoken varieties of language rather than the written varieties. So, what are some of the essential differences between the two? And what do linguists mean when they say that the spoken language is primary and the written language is secondary? So what we want to see is, we want you to judge these questions. What do you understand by the term? Vernacular is very important. When do you use such a variety? How easy or difficult is self-observation of that variety? On the whole, we will be concerned with the spoken varieties of language rather than the written varieties. So what we are trying to do is that we're going to study the spoken variety instead of paying attention to the written varieties. So what are the essential differences between the two, of spoken and written? So there are huge many differences between the written variety and the spoken variety. And what do linguists mean when they say that the spoken language is primary and the written language is secondary? What do they mean by that? How can they say that spoken language would be primary or comes first and written language would be secondary? And how do people relate to the spoken and written varieties? So you want to judge that also. Now, in an overview, we would say that sociolinguistics brings together linguists and sociolinguists to investigate matters of joint concern. So, but they are not the only researchers involved in studies in language and society. So sociolinguistics are not the only people who are studying the researching about language and society. Scholars from a variety of other disciplines have an interest too. Like anthropologists have an interest in studying the language in society. Psycholinguists, now anthropologists would be like they would study the ancient times of writing or language, the way people used to use it in the ancient times according to that society. Let's say like in the time of the cavemen, at that time people, the cavemen used to draw pictures on the walls instead of speaking. So they didn't have a spoken language at that time, and their written form was not in alphabets like in the Latin alphabet or any alphabet. But they would tell even full, complete stories by just the pictures they drew on the walls. So they can see historical things and study the pictures and try to interpret that. So that would be anthropologists. Psychologists would study psycholinguistics, how the language would relate to the brain. Then educators, people who are professors, teachers, and so on and so forth, and planners also. So we will see, for example, that a number of anthropologists have done work which we can describe as sociolinguistic in nature. So when we look at it, we say that anthropologists have done so much work that when we look at it, we would say that that's something that a sociolinguistic would do. Now, for example, in exploration of kinship systems, that is one thing that anthropology has studied. Now, the same may be said for certain psychologists, particularly those concerned with the possible effects of linguistic structure on social and psychological behavior. So the same may be said for certain psychologists. We would say that particularly those that are concerned with the possible effects of linguistic structure and how that would affect the social and the psychological behavior of a human being. So many educators too must make decisions about matters involving language, such as teaching of standard languages and the skills of literacy. As we will discover in the latter case, some sociolinguistics have been quite active in trying to influence educators in their attitudes towards certain kinds of linguistic behavior or varieties of language, let's say, spoken by specific groups of children. So when we say that many educators would look at the matters involving in language and the way the teaching standards are of languages and the skills of literacy. So sociolinguists have quite an active way in trying to influence the educators in their attitudes towards the certain kinds of linguistic behavior or varieties of language that they are teaching to children or that are being spoken by children in specific groups, such as the English spoken by certain black inhabitants of many cities in the northern United States, a variety sometimes referred to as African American Vernacular English. So when you do look at that, the African American people living in the United States, especially in the northern United States, they have a different way. You can even see that in movies nowadays. When you look at the English movies, you would see that Caucasian or fair-skinned person will speak the English language in a different way and a different mannerism than a black person would. Now, he has his own way of pronouncing words, their tone of voice, their articulation, everything is different. The way they pronounce the words, the way the rise and fall of their voice, these all things they are concerned with, that it's different. So there is a difference between that. So sometimes we could maybe say that the educators would try to influence the social linguist, would try to tell them that these things need to be corrected in the society so that everybody sounds the same way. So language planners then come in. Now language planners would obviously need a considerable amount of linguistic knowledge in making sound decisions about, for example, which language or language variety to encourage in certain circumstances, or in any attempts to standardize a particular language or variety, or to exchange existing relationships between languages or varieties. So we will observe that there are many interconnections between sociolinguistics and other disciplines, and also between concerns which are sometimes labeled theoretical and others which are said to be practical. Now, at very least, sociolinguistics is a socially relevant variety of linguistics, but it is probably much more. So you will be able to form your own views on both issues as we would proceed through the various topics treated in the chapters that would be following now. Now, these chapters are organized within 4 general topics. However, now there will be considerable moving back and forth with cross-referencing within topics and among topics also. So interrelationships are everywhere, and I make no apology for that. So part 1, languages and communities, they deals with some traditional language issues. Trying to separate language from dialects and looking at types of regional and social variation within languages, reviewing the phenomena of pidgins and creoles, conceiving of languages as codes, and trying to figure out what kinds of groups are relevant when we study the language use. So part 2 would be inherent variety. Now, is sometimes regarded as core sociolinguistics. Now, here the concerns are factors in language variation and what these might show us about how languages change. So part 3, words at work, is concerned with some traditional and social and cultural issues also. So language as a possible shaper of culture. So how language affects the culture and how it could shape the culture, and the differences in how people would use the language to shape the culture. So speech in a broad social context terms of address and expressions of politeness and what they mean. So, and certain essential characteristics of everyday language, for example, how utterances can be acts and how conversations would work. So part 4 would be understanding and intervening. Understanding and intervening looks into 3 areas of life in which sociolinguistics offers us some hope of understanding pressing problems, and which some sociolinguists argue require our deliberate intervention also. So gender. Now, one of the great growth areas in language study is the first of these. Education, particularly because certain practices seem to advantage now some students and disadvantage others, is the second also. So language planning issues, as well as the spread of English and the death of many languages, as the third. So sociolinguistics, now languages treated in a way of languages and communities. Now in language there are only differences. Fernanda de Saussure said the same thing. So strange the difference of men's talk. Samuel Pepys said that. Now choice words and measured phrase, above the reach of ordinary men, a stately speech by William Wordsworth. Now correct English is the slang of prigs who write history and essays, George Eliot. Language is by its very nature a communal thing. That is, it expresses never the exact thing but a compromise, that which is common to you, me and everybody. Now T. Holme, I include Pidgin English, even though I am referred to in that splendid language as "Fella belong Mrs. Queen," Prince Philip said that. So that would be the difference between it. Now, when we study two languages, the dialects and the varieties of languages in social linguistics. Now, I stated in the introductory chapter that all languages exhibit internal variation. That is, each language exists in a number of varieties and is, in one sense, a sum of those varieties. So, but we would say that yes, it's a sum up of that variety. But what do we mean by variety? Now, Hudson in 1996 defines a variety of language as a set of linguistic items with similar distribution. Now, a definition that allows us to say that all of the following are varieties: Canadian English, London English, the English of football, commentaries, and so on. So maybe we could say that they're all varieties of a similar of one language. So according to Hudson, this definition also allows us to treat all the languages of some multilingual speaker or community as a single variety. So we wouldn't be saying that these are different varieties. We would say that it's a single variety, since all the linguistic items concerned have a similar social distribution. So they do have a similar social distribution in it. So that's why we wouldn't be considering them as separate varieties of in one language. Now, a variety can therefore be something greater than a single language as well as something less. Now, less even than something traditionally referred to as a dialect. So Ferguson in 1972 offers other definition of variety also. Now, anybody of human speech patterns which is sufficiently homogeneous to be analyzed by available techniques of synchronic description, and which has a sufficiently large repertory of elements and their arrangements or processes with a broad enough semantic scope of function in all formal contexts of communication. So note the word sufficiency, sufficiently homogeneous in this last quotation, because complete homogeneity is not required. So there is always some variation, whether we consider a language as a whole, a dialect of that language, the speech of a group within that dialect, or ultimately each individual in that group. So such variation is a basic fact of linguistic life. Now, Hudson and Ferguson agree in defining variety in terms of a specific set of linguistic terms. Items. For example, human speech patterns, presumably sounds, words, grammatical features, etc., which we can uniquely associate with some external factor, presumably a geographical area or a social group. Now, consequently, if we can identify such a unique set of items or patterns for each group in question, then it might be possible to say that there are such varieties as Standard English, Cockney, lower class, New York City speech, Oxford English, Legalese, cocktail party talk, and so on. So those would be different dialects. So consequently, we could say that a unique set of items or patterns to each group, that it might be possible to say that these are such varieties in language. So, or the British English and the American English have a difference also. But their difference is more not just in the pronunciation. There is a difference in pronunciation, but also in the way some words are spelled and written. So spellings is a difference also between both of them. So one important task then in social linguistics is to determine if such unique sets of items or patterns do exist or they don't. So as we proceed, we will encounter certain difficulties, but it is unlikely that we will easily abandon the concept of variety, no matter how serious these difficulties would prove to be. So another part of a discussion would be that I have just suggested that although a concept like variety is difficult to define, it may still be useful in social linguistic work. So linguists have found such concepts as sound, syllable, word, and sentence equally difficult to define, in contrast to lay usage, in which they are just assumed to be obvious and uncontroversial. So in one sense, linguistics is all about trying to provide adequate definitions for words such as sounds, syllable, word, sentence, and language. So what are some of the problems you are aware of concerning the linguist difficulty with these words and the associated concepts? Now, what parallels do you see, if any, between these problems and the sociolinguistic problems with variety and the other terms to be used in the remainder of this chapter? So Hames would say in 1974 has observed that language boundaries between groups are drawn not on the basis of the use of linguistic items alone, because attitudes and social meanings attached to those items also count. Now he says an enduring social relationship or group may come to define itself by selection or creation of linguistic features, and a difference of accent may be as important as one boundary as the difference of grammar at another. So part of the creativity of users of language lies in the freedom to determine what and how much linguistic differences matters. And how does this interrelationship between linguistic items and the social evaluations for such items apply in how we regard each of the following pronunciations? So butter, butter, burr, those is another one. Fishing, fishin, farm, farm. Now farm is in the American English, you see, and in British English we would say farm. So farm, giving the definition to the R, would be American, and farm would be the British. Now with pronounced with like with, Cuba pronounced as Cuber, eight pronounced like eight, like at, then bean pronounced like bean, like in bin, and then mischievous pronounced with four syllables as mischievous, or aluminum and aluminum, police, guitar, Detroit, with the stress as indicated, Detroit. So we're putting stress. Now this signal that you would see in the slides, that you put a line on top of a word, that is where you want to put stress on that word. Police, so you're putting stress on O. Then guitar on U. Detroit, Detroit. So putting stress on E. And each of the following utterances: he hurt himself, he done it, he dove it, dove in, he ran away last week, it looks like it's going to rain, to whom did you give it, she's taller than me now. Languages, dialects, and varieties, you can check those out. As yesterday he laid down after lunch for an hour. Now, can I leave the room? He ain't got no money left. So that would be how a black would say it. He ain't got no money left. Or try and do it soon. Between you and me, I don't like it. Now there's $20 for you to spend. She invited Sally and I to the party. I wants it, like how a child would say, instead of that I want it. So you done it, did you? Then stand over by them boys. Is he the one what said it? So instead of what, it should be who said it. They don't learn you nothing there. You see? Now, these are the wrong ways of different pronunciations, and how they twist the language and is not the correct way of pronouncing the words. So in language and dialect, now for many people there can be no confusion at all about what language they speak. Now, for example, they are Chinese, they are Japanese or Korean, they would speak Chinese, Japanese, or Korean respectively. Now, it is as simple as that, but language and authenticity are virtually synonymous. So a Chinese may be surprised to find that another person who appears to be Chinese does not speak Chinese. And some Japanese have gone so far as to claim not to be able to understand Caucasians who speak fluent Japanese. So just as such a strong connection between language and authenticity may prove to be invaluable in nation building, it can also be fraught with problems when individuals and groups seek to realize some other identity. So for example, to be both Chinese and American, or to be Canadian rather than Korean Canadian. So as we will see, many Americans seem particularly reluctant to adequate language with authenticity in their own case. Now, although they regard English as the natural language of Americans, they do not consider American to be an ethnic label. The result may be the same, only the reasons differ. So most speakers can give a name to whatever it is they speak. On occasion, some of these names may appear to be strange to those who take a scientific interest in language. But we should remember that human naming practices often have a large unscientific component to them. So census takers in India find themselves confronted with a wide array of language names when they ask people what language or languages they speak. So names are not only ascribed by region, which is what we might expect, but sometimes also by the caste, religion, village, and so on. So moreover, they can change from census to census as the political and social climate of the country changes. So while people do usually know what language they speak, they may not always lay claim to be fully qualified speakers of that language. So they may experience difficulty in deciding whether what they speak should be called a language proper or merely a dialect of some language. So such indecision is not surprising. Now, exactly how do you decide what is a language and what is a dialect of language? So what criteria can you possibly use to determine that? And whereas variety X is a language, variety Y is only a dialect of a language. So what are the essential differences between a language and dialect? And Hugon in 1966 has pointed out that language and dialect are ambiguous terms. Ordinary people use these terms quite freely in speech. For them, a dialect is almost certainly no more than a local, non-prestigious, therefore powerless variety of real language. So in contrast, scholars often experience considerable difficulty in deciding whether one term should be used rather than any other in certain situations. So as Hugon says, the terms represent a simple dichotomy in a situation that is almost infinitely complex. So he points out that the confusion goes back to the ancient Greeks, the time the languages were started. So the Greek language that we associate with ancient Greece was actually a group of distinct local varieties, Ionic, Doric, and Attic, descended by divergence from a common spoken source, with each variety having its own literary traditions and uses. For example, now laconic for history, Doric for choral and lyric works, and Attic for tragedy. Now later Ethnian Greek, the Koine or common language, became the norm of the spoken language. So as Greek and Latin, as you know, is the first languages, very, very old. And most of your English language is derived through Greek also. Now there are so many, like the English word or the alphabets of English language are basically based on Greek and Latin roots. Now a root would be the center of the language, the meaning. Then you add a prefix and a suffix to the word to make a complete English word. So the basic roots were either Latin or Greek in English language. So it became the norm of the spoken language as the various spoken varieties converged on the dialect of the major cultural and administrative center. Now, Hugon points out that the Greek situation has provided the model for all later usages of the two terms with the resulting ambiguity. Now, languages can be used to refer either to a single linguistic norm or to a group of related norms, and dialect to refer to one of the norms also. So the situation is further confused by the distinction the French make between undialecte and unpetois. The former is a regional variety of language. Undialecte would be a regional variety of language that has an associated literary tradition, whereas the latter, that unpetois, is a regional variety that lacks such a literary tradition. So therefore, petois tends to be used pejoratively. It is regarded as something less than a dialect because of its lack of an associated literature. So even a language like Breton, a Celtic language still spoken in parts of Brittany, is called a petois because of its lack of a strong literary tradition, and the fact that it is not some country's language. So however, dialect in French, like a dialect in German, cannot be used in connection with the standard language. For example, no speaker of French considers standard French to be a dialect of French. So, in contrast, it is not uncommon to find references to standard English being a dialect. Now, admittedly, a very important one of English. Now, Huygens points out that while speakers of English have never seriously adopted petois as a term to be used in the description of language, they have tried to employ both language and dialect in a number of conflicting senses. So, dialect is used both for local varieties of English, Yorkshire dialect, and for various types of informal or lower class or rural speech also. So in general use, it therefore remains quite underdefined whether such dialects are part of a language or not. Now, in fact, the dialect is often thought of as an understanding outside the language. So as a social norm, then a dialect is a language that is excluded from polite society. So it is often equivalent to non-standard or even substandard when such terms are applied to language. And it can connote various degrees of inferiority, with that connotation of inferiority carried over those who speak a dialect. So some people have that inferiority complex of how non-standard and even standard languages, or how you apply it to language. So we can observe too that questions such as which language do you speak, or which dialect do you speak, may be answered quite who appear to speak in an identical manner. As Gumpers in 1982 pointed out, many regions of the world would provide plenty of evidence for what he calls a bewildering array of language and dialect divisions. He adds, socio-historical factors play a crucial role in determining boundaries. Now, in Hindi and Urdu in India, Serbian and Croatian in Yugoslavia of that date, and Fanti and Twi in West Africa, Bokmål and Nynorsk in Norway, Quechua and Aymara in Peru, to name just a few, are recognized as discrete languages both popularly and in law, yet they are almost identical at the level of grammar. So, on the other hand, the literary and colloquial forms of Arabic used in Iraq, Morocco, and Egypt, or the Welsh of North and South Wales, the local dialects of Rajasthan and Bihar in North India are grammatically quite separate. So, yet only one language is recognized in each case. So the Hindi Urdu situation that Gumpers mentions is in an interesting one. Now, Hindi and Urdu are the same language, but one in which certain differences are becoming more and more magnified for political and religious reasons. Now, Hindi is written left to right in the Devanagari script, whereas Urdu is written right to left in the Arabic Persian script. So the way they write Hindi would be from left to right, and we write Urdu from the right to left in the Arabic or Persian script. Now, whereas Hindi draws on Sanskrit for its borrowings, Urdu draws on Arabic and Persian sources. So large religious and political differences make much of a small linguistic difference. So the written forms of the two varieties, now particularly those favored by elites, also emphasizes these differences. Now they have become highly symbolic of the growing differences between India and Pakistan. Now we should note that the situation in India and Pakistan is in almost direct contrast to that which exists in China, where mutually unintelligible Chinese language called dialects by the Chinese themselves are united through a common writing system and tradition. So Gumpers in 1971 points out that everyday living in parts of India, particularly in large cities and among educated segments of those communities, requires some complex choices involving the distinction between Hindi and Urdu. So since independence, Hindi has become compulsory in schools, but Urdu continues to be used extensively in commerce also. And the ghazal, and the best known form of Urdu poetry, is universally popular also. So if we look at the modern realist Hindi writers, we find that they utilize both Sanskrit and Persian borrowings. So the juxtaposition of the two styles serves to express subtle shades of meaning and to lend reality to their writings. Now similarly, on the conversational level, the use of Hindi and Urdu forms is not simply a matter of birth and education. But just as it is customary for individuals to alternate between dialect and standard depending on the social location, so when using the standard itself, the speaker may select from a range of alternatives. So Hindi and Urdu therefore might best be characterized not in terms of actual speech, but as norms of ideal behavior in the sociologist sense. So the extent to which a speaker's performance in a particular communication situation approximates the norm is a function of the combination of factors such as family background, regional origin, education and social attitude and the like. So far as everyday use is concerned, therefore it appears that the boundary between the spoken varieties of Hindi and Urdu is somewhat flexible and the one that changes with circumstances. So this is exactly what we expect. There is considerable variety in everyday use, but somewhere in the background there is an ideal that can be appealed to, proper Hindi or proper Urdu. So, in the first of the two quotations from Gumpers, there is a reference to Yugoslavia, a country now brutally dismembered by the instruments of the ethnicity, language and religion. Now, within the old Yugoslavia, Serbs and Croats failed to agree on most things. And after the death of the president Tito, the country, slowly at first and then ever more rapidly later, fell into a fatal divisiveness. So Slovenes and Macedonians excised themselves most easily, but the Serbs and the Croats were not so lucky to do that. So linguistically, Serbo-Croatian is a single South Slav language, but one used by two groups of people. Now the Serbs and Croats, with somewhat different historical, cultural and religious backgrounds, there is a third group in Bosnia, a Muslim group, who also speak Serbo-Croatian. And their existence further compounded the problems and increased the eventual bloodshed. So finally there is a very small Montenegrin group. The Serbian and Croatian varieties of Serbo-Croatian are known as Srpski and Srpsko-Vatski respectively. So the actual differences between them involve different preferences in vocabulary rather than differences in pronunciation or grammar. Now that is Serbs and Croats often use different words for the same concepts. For example, Serbian veros and Croatian grad for train, and the varieties are written in different scripts, Roman for Croatian or Cyrillic for Serbian, which also reflect the different religious loyalties of Croats and Serbs, or the Catholic and the Orthodox. So as conflict grew, differences became more and more important, and the country and the language split apart. So now in Serbia, people speak Serbian just as they speak Croatian in Croatia, and Serbo-Croatian no longer exists as a language of the Balkans. And now that there is a separate Bosnia, the Bosnians call their variety Bosanski, and Montenegrins call their variety Crnogorski. So that you can see a reference in Carmichael 2002 on page 236 and Greenberg in 2004. So in direct contrast to the above situation, we can observe that the loyalty of a group of people need not necessarily be determined by the language they speak. So although the majority of the people in Alsace are speakers of a variety of German insofar as the language of their home life is concerned. Now their loyalty is unquestionably towards France. So they look west, not east, for national leadership, and they use French, not German, as the language of mobility and higher education. So what we want to do now is that we want to end the lecture here, and we will continue it studying about sociolinguistics. I'll give you a brief outline and introduction of sociolinguistics in the first part of the next lecture, and then we can continue from the different varieties of language from here. So that would be it for today. Thank you so much. Good day.